Welcome to The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill. The Burning Question, where we ask the questions no one wants to answer.
Welcome to The Burning Question, where we ask the questions that no one wants to answer. I'm Pamela Segneri.
And I'm Paul Tothill. And our guests today are Todd Weatherly, an apostolic leader with a background in psychology, and Gerard Michel, a pastor with a background in sociology, psychology, and apologetics.
And the burning question for today is religion relevant to society today? It's a big question, Paul.
It's a big question, and I think a lot of people that might be watching this program, general public, would say, well, how relevant is religion? I mean, we look at the institution of religion, we look at the Royal Commission, we look at all sorts of things, and we really have to ask ourselves, is religion relevant anymore? Have we gone beyond religion? Yeah. So to deal with that question, can I put it another way, gentlemen? How do we properly define what religion is? What is religion? I mean, there's a proper understanding of what is religion and what's not religion. So do you have a perspective on either that? Maybe Todd first.
Look, I think if you're going to have a fairly standard, rigid definition of religion, it would be a system of faith and worship, belief in a supernatural God or being. But as you were saying before, if you ask the average person on the street, are you religious? Probably more people would identify themselves these days as spiritual as opposed to religious.
Mm-hmm.
So Gerard, is there something of the idea of religion that could be a little bit misconstrued in the public domain?
Yeah, I think it's a word we use in so many different ways, and we're not always conscious of how we're using it, and certainly we need to clarify what religion means. Like, for example, speaking about spirituality instead of religion really has connotation of something being a lot more subjective, my own experience of what I would like to do or what I think, as compared to religion, which tends to have a structure and a system attached to it.
Yeah, and I think these days people really don't relate to the structure, do they? Because years ago, I can remember, well, a couple of years ago as a teenager, that we used to get lots of walk-ins in the church. You know, people would just come. But we don't seem to see that so much.
Okay.
Well, do you think then that the public see church and religion and God as one? Do you think that's a possible perspective that they carry? Yeah. When they look at the church, they're looking to their mind at God. They don't separate the church and its institution and its religious ways with God. And so when they see what appears to them an antiquated system, are they saying, well, what's the relevance of this anymore? That maybe that was good for the Dark Ages or you know, when Jesus was alive or some other time. But really, aren't we a bit more intelligent these days than to believe in some stories?
With all the scientific breakthroughs and what all the advancement, all the different areas, I think still people, it comes down to association. So you've gone to private school, you've university educated, but still you're going to identify with something through association.
Of course.
So if you have a family background and it was either a great experience or you had a spiritual encounter or you found it dry and irrelevant, I think with all the labels and people always, it's a through association. And I do think that people if they do have a negative association, they tend to lump them all together.
Yep.
And so that's why I think spirituality is probably, as you were saying before, because it's a very personal thing and a subjective thing as opposed to the system of religion. I don't think people identify with it as much as maybe they did in other generations.
And of course, some people have had bad experiences with religion, and of course by association, but now there is another level, is that religion in the media is also associated with things like sexual abuse and violence, and we have a class of critics like the new atheists who are way right out there with saying that religion causes all the problems in the world. So although we live in an age of information, I don't necessarily think that people are more literate about religion, but they hear a lot of things from a certain perspective about religion.
But isn't this an age-old debate? I mean, Jesus himself confronted a religious spirit and the traditions of man in religion, in Judaism, all through the Gospels. I mean, he was counter-religious in one sense, and he brought this empowering truth. I mean, it seems like the idea of man forming ideas about God and putting regulations, rules and traditions around it is nothing new.
No, it isn't. But of course, what is different is that the priorities have changed. It's not only religion that has suffered, but it's also things like tradition. And so things have changed where people used to probably consider the things of the spiritual things as being on a higher story and being important to life. Now it's not so necessarily anymore.
Or it's different. People's spirituality is different. They use that word to encompass all sorts of things. That it's not necessarily relating to a god, any god, but it can be relating to crystals, or it can be relating to tarot cards, or whatever. There's all sorts of things that people would consider as spiritual.
Yeah, and not to put it to not to be cynical about it, but it's just it's really, maybe it's become more of a lifestyle choice rather than a worldview, significance of life, reason, meaning, morality thing.
So it would seem this idea of religion and the language of religion covers a very broad brush, but it then seems as if we drill down a bit and we start to explore it, that we actually come back to this deep longing that's in humanity to be spiritual in any event.
You know, I have the opportunity to do a lot of travel. I don't see people, they're not looking or yearning for a religion.
No.
They're yearning and looking for meaning. And what happens is that it starts to manifest in spiritual ways. And there's a massive diversity of how people search and go about it. But you see it even because, I mean, we're coming into in the Western Hemisphere, a new generation. And I have the opportunity to travel to Western nations and many others. But there actually is a searching in every single culture and every generation. It happens over and over again.
So hold that thought. We're going to come back to this searching, and we're just going to take a few quick commercial breaks.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Lemex Timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Lemex. Lemex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your host Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Welcome back. Now, Todd, you were talking about man's search, which is really what we're made for, isn't it?
Yeah. As I was saying, I have an opportunity to see a lot of different cultures, and people are searching, and they seem to every generation, and everyone expresses it in different ways. But I think on a spiritual level, people yearn the big questions to be answered about their life's meaning, maybe about they yearn to be part of community somewhere, somehow, and also maybe their identity. And those things, you can't separate them from spirituality. Those are actually, they permeate every part of our life.
So the desire to be loved and to love,
to belong, yes.
To belong and sense of community, to have purpose in our life.
Yes.
And really to know, they're the big questions, aren't they? To know who I am
yes.
in this big picture.
I think because we're developing, we're getting a lot more specific in our language. I think identity is absolutely central to people's spiritual search. It really, really is.
Yeah.
And it's not just belonging in a people group or a culture or family. People are actually looking, who am I and why am I here?
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And maybe this is something to say for religion, is that it is tied up with the human being. It's not just a socially constructed thing that can be removed and replaced by something better, because we've seen through history examples of people, leaders that went about getting rid of religion. That didn't work. So religion is very much part of the human being. It's part of us, like art and music and other things are. And of course we know it's a social institution as well. So we cannot do without that aspect of our lives.
Is it the word though? I mean, is it the word that perhaps in society today seems a little bit irrelevant? If we looked at it as a faith community, or I don't know. I'm just, because it seems to be the word that trips people up.
I think that it's a label that doesn't relate to this generation. It just
Absolutely
doesn't.
not.
It just doesn't.
No.
And as you were saying before, rather than it being a social construct or a means to control people, I believe it's organic, that spiritual search, because you see it all different ages, and funnily enough, people trot along with their life, or they do university, or they play football, or they do this or that, and quite often the thing that seems to trigger is some sort of crisis.
Yeah.
Rightly or wrongly,
Yeah.
because then they go, wow, is this all there is? Is this what it's about? But I've seen that time and time again in my own personal life, but crisis seems to cause people to dig below the surface of just fitting in and hanging out with your mates. It triggers something that's organic. I see it all the time.
Yeah.
So do you think then religion, as it's presented as a construct, but detached from that connection to God, supplies the life force that people are searching for?
Well, I think that what happens is that as you separate that from the purest point of view, is that desire to connect with God, a supernatural being, and then you start going through the rituals, the empty ceremony. As those two become separated, that's when it becomes irrelevant.
Yeah.
And every generation has to rediscover the actual substance and the core values, or even the experience, and not just the empty ceremony. I think if there's an alienation, it is people see empty ritual, ceremony and tradition that they don't see relevant to them.
Yeah. Would you agree with that, Gerard?
Yeah, I would agree with this analysis. I'm just thinking about another dimension of the question about, that in our day and age, people tend to accept that scientific facts are the stuff of life. But when it comes to religion, they put it in a different category. And maybe in some way we need to make a case for religion and make a case of how beneficial it is to the human person, but also make probably more than that, is to talk about religion as really providing the stuff of human life that science cannot do, in spite of everything that it has, which is a dimension that science is actually quite narrow in what it can tackle, and the big questions of life are really not often answered.
Well, science itself is divided, isn't it? You have philosophical science, you have
Correct.
theoretical science,
Yes.
and you have empirical science. So even when we talk about science, we have to be careful about science. But one might argue that science has actually demonstrated the truth of Scripture.
Yeah, in lots of cases.
Modern discoveries, neuroplasticity of the mind.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
let's face it, in the Scriptures talk about germs before germs were even discovered.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, they're interesting things, aren't they?
I remember looking into this, and Moses got clear instruction from God to, they should wash their hands in running water.
Yes.
Whereas they didn't follow that during the Black Plague in the Middle Ages. They would wash it in a bowl of water after doing an autopsy on a dead diseased body. Then they'd go and do work on somebody else, and they wondered why disease spread. If somebody's sick, they have to go into quarantine. And this is way before the discovery of microbiology and germs, Louis Pasteur, etc. Really, really interesting stuff.
Yeah, and even in the area of neuropsychology, we have neuroplasticity of the mind. That means you can actually reform your mind.
Yes.
Yeah.
What did Paul the Apostle say to Romans? Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Live a transformed life. And here it is being proven as a physiological, psychological, emotional and spiritual truth.
If you change how you think long enough, it actually rewires your brain. And that was thousands of years ago. He said if you do that, you will be transformed. And I think the interesting question is, you talked about theoretical science and empirical science. Really, I don't see with spirituality and science, they're not mutually exclusive.
No, they're not.
They're not at all.
Good theology goes well with good science.
Yep.
Bad theology doesn't go well with good science, and bad science doesn't go well with good theology. But they're not opposed. But I think people's perception in the society today is that religion is in the area of value, therefore it's not self-evident in that sense.
Yep.
But science is in the area of facts.
So we're going to hold that thought, and we're going to come back after a few commercials.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Limex Timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Limex. Limex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your host Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Welcome back. We're getting quite excited here because discussions get quite heated sometimes, but it's all good. But it's important for us to let you know that all religions aren't the same, and where we're coming from is a Christian point of view. I want you to know we did invite other people from other belief systems to come on and join this discussion, but they weren't game. They weren't happy to do so. But where we'd like to kind of bridge this is into faith, because this is the key, isn't it? It's a faith. It's a system of faith. It's not about a church building. It's not about an organisation. This is a living thing.
I think that's if it's an organic reality, it's going to transcend culture and generation.
Yeah.
And we were talking before about science, and when I did my science degree, I found it interesting that we got the philosophy of science is that you've got raw data or information. You actually come with a predisposed idea or bias or hypothesis, and then you use that predisposition to join the dots.
Yeah.
And so not all science is science as we would see it, but what I find fascinating is what we were saying in the break about faith. And that a really basic rudimentary definition of religion is belief in a supernatural, superhuman force or being. And when people connect on a faith level, there's even a place where they transcend what we would consider natural laws. I was visiting a friend last night, and she was going blind in one eye to the point she'd lost most of the vision. She prayed, and it was a period of over weeks and maybe even months, but she actually showed me where on the test that they did, the person testing her eyes went into shock because she actually had what, medically verified a creative miracle. And it wasn't something you could rationalise or scientifically prove, but it was scientifically verified. So I think that area of faith has something so powerful and an organic reality that you can see nearly every culture and every generation, which is amazing.
When faith appears to evaporate in society, Is it because we have a particular worldview that excludes the idea that there's anything beyond the seen realm?
Yeah, we do have this worldview. It's a we could call it scientific naturalism, which is, you know, it's what we perceive through the senses, it's what we can test, it's what's real. So religion is a kind of a airy-fairy thing, you know, of
Gnomes at the bottom of the garden type thing.
Yeah, but that everybody can make their choice, but it's not perceived. And so often in life what happens is we create this dichotomy and we live in different ways. So and even Christians do that. We end up divorcing what we do on Sunday with the rest of the week, what we do in our personal lives from our professional lives, from the decisions we make, from our personal, private salvation and devotion, from, you know, culture, the public sphere. We create these two things there because we feel that this is a personal, subjective thing. I think Christians should do something about that because I mean, I can only speak for Christianity because I must allow other leaders of other religions to speak for themselves. But Christians need to do something about that because that process of creating that chasm between things is actually a process of secularization.
Yes.
So secularization, taking a worldview, taking an educated view over time, I mean, I hate to use the idea that we're being culturalized or programmed, but dominant themes do come through in society and they're accepted by each generation by the dominant voices, aren't they? And what if a dominant voice says, well, this is how the world is, and we exclude the conversation about all the other evidence that points to there's maybe other world. For example, science itself, between theoretical science, quantum physics, the whole idea of wormholes and those kinds of things, with empirical science and physics would have a discussion. Empirical science would say to theoretical science, that's just a philosophy. But we all know 1 + 1 = 2, you can't see it, but you know it's true. Plato talked about these forms, these inherent values. I mean, have we been dumbed down a little bit?
Oh yeah. That's
think
why we're doing this show.
If you are, and this principle goes across the board, if you're talking about socialisation, so you're in a small village and you're brought up, and then your parents and the elders teach you, and you get that process of being socialised into the cultural values and mores and norms. Okay, so that's the same everywhere, whether it's in family, culture, or religion. So what I think has happened now, is there social engineering going on, this and that? Well, here's the interesting part, is we have unprecedented access to media, to information, and if there was a perception out there that, you know, if we wanted to push that, you know, religion is irrelevant or there's no spiritual world or supernatural, it's a lot easier to put across anyway. So without people realising it, they can read a newspaper these days on a smartphone, and we're getting encultured and socialised along certain lines, especially in the Western Hemisphere. But the amazing part is that there is an explosion of people, spirituality all around the world, but it might not be reported on in the media.
Well,
yes, that's a good point.
What's not reported in the media, of course, is the converse, the other side of the coin from religion causes trouble, for example. How often do we hear on the media the benefits of faith or religion? Now, the interesting thing is that this has got also a scientific dimension, because there's been research done sociologically, there's been research done even with psychiatry and psychology, and if you were to say, well, you know, well, again, when I say religion, I'm talking about the Christian religion in our society, correlates with well-being, correlates with health.
That's right.
Correlates with less suicide, correlates with meaning, correlates with the ability to sustain difficulties and suffering, etc., etc., etc. That's the converse.
That's right.
And if we could hear that more often, it would influence people to think too.
Absolutely.
And that's
so
the point.
hold that thought, because we're taking a commercial break. And Paul's going to be right back with this very important question.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Limex Timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Limex. Limex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your host Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Welcome back. Now, Paul, that burning question you had.
I had a burning question, and which comes back to Todd's statement about faith, and I think it joins in nicely. So there is something of this value of faith in believing in someone greater than yourself, living beyond yourself. We've seen the evidence in medical terms, in psychology terms, neuropsychology terms. There is some real evidence out there now. But isn't it inspiring to be able to put your trust in somebody that's greater than yourself?
Look, I personally, yes, I do. I think what we're seeing at the moment on a societal level, whether it's social media, whatever, is you are seeing people who are, their whole world is themselves.
Yes.
They are so wrapped up in themselves. It could be a form of narcissism. But the problem is if you're not going that great, is the whole world not going that great that day? And I think there's something very healthy to be invested, not just in others and not just self-centered, but just, wow, you know, there is somebody or something greater than me that you can connect to. And I think that's very, very important, because I think it's very dangerous when people become utterly self-absorbed. That's why we're seeing so much depression, pandemic and mental illness, psychosomatic diseases. I think that's a major issue. And as you were saying before, the scientific health benefits, sociological benefits, everything, it's shown that having a significant faith really, really does empower you to have a quality of life.
Yeah, and I think there's a strong case in saying that religion, for me, the Christian faith is beneficial to people and helpful.
Yes.
I think we could make a real strong case about that. But of course, we got to go beyond that. We got to come to a place where we look at something and say that it is true in many different aspects. Not just helpful, but true. And that's a difficult discussion to have these days. But when you list the benefits, and you can say then, you know, when, for example, the view in the media about what religion, violence, abuse, and things like that, when we go to the person of Jesus Christ, we realize that what he taught and how he lived at his trial and the things that happened, Jesus was completely anti-violence. Those who take the sword or weapons to fight for what they believe in Christianity are not following Jesus. They're actually denying him.
That's
you know, when it comes to the abuse of children, Jesus said it would be better for a millstone to be put around somebody's neck. So really, there's religion, and then there is who is Jesus and what did he say?
So faith is not in man or a structure or an institution, but in God. And that's where we say there's lots of discussion that there may be people that take a view there's a different God, and different religions support their God. But the Bible's very clear, isn't it, about the one true God. There are other gods, but there's the one true God that gives life. That's the Christian position, isn't there?
That's right.
The difficulty is humanity's experience of the outworking of Christ being life through humanity, isn't it? Because we've become imperfect representations of the one we are trying to grow in and to emulate.
Yes.
And there's got to be a fair comment to say, well, religion hasn't always done that well. We see extremes in all religions.
It's an interesting point with the Christian faith. When Jesus came, he was not pro-religion necessarily.
No.
So what you have is that God giving expression and a covenant and a mandate to express spirituality. Then what happened is that man starts to corrupt it, and religion becomes a vehicle for self-promotion, self-aggrandizement. It starts to become corrupted. Jesus came at the fulcrum of that, and he actually condemned it.
Yes.
And he said, love people, help people. Don't be emotive. Don't be be agenda driven to promote yourself. But actually, there's a richness, a simplicity, and a purity of worshiping God, loving people, helping people, and so there actually is that. Even Jesus made that distinction and differentiation.
Yes, yeah.
Well,
and I think that's
modelled it very well.
He modelled it, and so every generation's challenge is that we can different ways take our eyes off of that, become corrupted. And I think that, again, getting back to how information is conveyed, whether it's the media or wherever, how it's portrayed, there would be thousands of airplanes going around the world at any given time. We don't focus on those. But when one crashes, the media is all over it. So when something within the church or another faith, something happens, wow, we're going to report on this as terrible, this religion is evil, but there's so many amazing things happening. Just look at the Salvation Army. Just look at how many people do they clothe and feed, yet it won't be reported. And so again, you've got that flow of information saying, religion, not relevant. Well, there's so many amazing things taking place all the time, whether we're aware of it or not.
That'd be quite true, wouldn't it, Gerard? I mean, we can't judge the world by simply what the media gives us, but that often is our world perspective, but it's so limited, isn't it? There must be all kinds of people doing all kinds of amazing things because of faith.
Well, they are. I mean, that's where the multiplication of information hasn't necessarily made us more informed. I mean, but there are some disciplines today that are neglected. History is one of them. I mean, if you go back historically in the history of the West, there is no way you can get away from the fact that where do we get human rights? Where do we get hospitals? Where do we get
orphanages,
schools?
charities?
Where do we
everything.
get these things? Now, if people went back and looked at that, they would see that this picture of religion going all
In the street commerce as well.
Well, trade unions even, you just can go on and on and on and on about these things, that the beneficial and what it's brought, what Christianity, even our democracy. It's going to be interesting because now we are having a little test to see whether democracy can exist without Christianity. That's going to be an interesting question because of what, for all the implications and the part that Christianity played in these things. So yes, there is an entirely different picture.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess we would say, well, actually democracy cannot exist because then you'll have a godless state, which is communism. So think about that while we take these commercial breaks.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Limex Timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Limex. Limex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Welcome back. Now, in the break, we were talking once again about identity because we're aware there is an identity crisis, particularly within young people, but people of any age at the moment.
Absolutely. What stock would you put on the value of identity both of you gentlemen are educated in these things, first of all from a secular point of view and then from a spiritual point of view. Gerard? Or?
Well, when I was doing psychology, there is power in when a child is developing, and very, very central is identifying with a same-sex parent or identifying with, there are different stages. And it's massive. So there's a point where when we're developing, we get our identity from an external source.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and so what is interesting is that society is changing, as we were discussing earlier, and you're finding that people used to get married younger, have a career younger, have a family younger, and now, and I understand that, from home ownership and the economics have changed, but kids are staying home longer, but not just staying at home longer from an economic point of view, is also is that developmentally they seem it's taking longer.
Yes.
And so that is completely tied in with identity. And again, if you're trying to find it all within yourself as opposed to your family or God or externally, there might actually be a delay, because this is what we're seeing anecdotally. And it's interesting, for every generation, you actually don't see the result of a trend until that generation's passed, and you can analyse it. So these things that are happening as we're talking, and we are just, we're discussing them, but the science is out, in regards to an empirical sense, but there are very much trends developing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, there's that sense of the personal identity of a person, but you could stretch this a bit more and talk about a more cosmic identity, if you want. How do you define the human being? Who am I? And I think although people may not ask this abstract question, it works down into their lives.
Absolutely.
Who am I if I'm not created, I don't have any reason to live, and there's no point to life? So there is a kind of a nihilistic approach to life. Who am I in that kind of climate?
And there's nothing after this.
Yeah.
And there's nothing
This
after.
is it.
This is it.
If we don't have hope, we don't have the ability to image who we really are, and we're all called to image, and that's what you're saying. Psychologically, we're called to image another, and we image our mother and father. Of course, the Bible would say, wouldn't it, we are created in God's image and likeness. So if that one imaging aspect of what we're designed for is destroyed, then we get a corrupt image of ourselves. Therefore, we get a corrupt expression of ourselves.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but the thing is, we're not consistent with these things because we make leaps.
Yes.
We believe science and the naturalistic worldview. We take that on board. That leads
we go shopping for what suits us.
Yeah, but that
Yes.
leads us to nihilism, leads us to meaninglessness.
Yeah.
But the average person doesn't live with that. They do a leap into especially postmoderns, they do a leap into the fact that, no, life is meaningful anyway, and it's worth caring for each other in terms of relationship. But that's a leap. There's no basis for
That's
that
right.
if you look at...
And it can become an abstraction as well that just doesn't hold up under crisis or pressure.
Well,
And that's the real
nihilism
point,
had
isn't
its
it?
own
Correct.
agenda and its own trajectory. And if anyone takes the time to study out that thought process and why it was brought into social engineering of nation states, you'd start to understand that we've been caught up in a historical development that we don't even understand how we even got here, because most people live day to day. We don't search for the answers in an academic way. We search for an immediate response answer to our day-to-day lives. That's how we live. We live emotionally. We live.
And so,
is there love? Is there not love? Am I loved? Am I not loved? Do I have provision? It's very immediate, isn't it?
What's fascinating is, getting back to more psychology, is that you've got your cognitive behaviour, but then you have affect, where we get the word affection, your feelings. Even though we have spirituality, most decisions people make on a daily basis, what do I feel like doing? Where am I? And so that can only be measured so much on a scientific level. And I think that, like I said, when we start to ascribe meaning in an abstract way, it won't hold up. It will affect how we feel, and it's massive. And then people, that whole issue of identity starts to, it doesn't hold anything anymore. And I've dealt with my fair share of people who are despondent, depressed, suicidal, without hope. But it's interesting with the abstraction, is that unfortunately, let's just say with a lot of religions, let's say Christianity, we've westernized it.
Yes.
And it doesn't work. That's the key.
Domesticated.
We've domesticated it, and so we've shopped. This works for me, this doesn't. So without getting back to identity, God says to Moses, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And that compound word is like a tree is one. You have roots, a trunk, you've got branches, you've got leaves, you've got fruit.
Yeah.
That tree is one. But in our society, we see ourselves as a singular.
Yeah.
Our identity is wrapped up in ourselves.
That's right.
We don't see ourselves one with either community or God, and that's where it starts to devolve. So we've actually tried to westernize spirituality, and it just doesn't work.
And the divine is socially constructed. It's your choice. It's not a transcendent.
No.
Yeah.
You know, somebody above from which gives bearing to your own life.
Yeah.
And it's amazing, isn't it, that you can't find your true identity outside a community.
It is. Well,
Because there's that constant interaction of imaging and releasing.
I personally believe that every single culture reflects an aspect of the kingdom of God. That's my personal view. So when I was studying village life in Africa, they have a saying called Ubuntu, and Ubuntu is you are who you are through others.
Yes.
Yep.
So it's completely steeped in community. Whereas now you got so many people in society in the Western Hemisphere feel alone, disconnected, disassociated. So they're trying to find meaning, but that's the prevailing feeling. And everything, it's great when you've got a good friendship group or you're part of a football or a sporting club or whatever. But when something goes wrong, then massive disassociation. Even with social media, they're saying the more people use it, the lonelier they feel.
That's right.
It's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to what we were talking about very early on about people being disconnected from religion or church or whatever because they've been hurt. You know, that's because they had no upward connection. It was always reliant upon this, which is important, but this should always lead us on and lead us up in that religious context rather than just, you know, you have to make me happy.
I guess, you know, we as Christian pastors or whatever, we look at history and we have to say, and we look at the phenomenon of religion in the world, even with the Christian religion in the world, we look at it and we have to say it's gone wrong in many ways.
Yeah.
But you know, there is a utopia where people, you know, John Lennon, imagine no religion, no this, and that would bring the utopia. Well, that's where we got to do some thinking. Will it, or will it not?
Well, I think John Lennon found out it didn't. So we're going to a commercial break, and we'll be back very, very soon.
The use of timber in your home creates a warmth that can't be surpassed by any other material. Solid timber complements almost every texture and colour. Let Limex Timber show you the warmth of Australian oak, the richness of real Baltic pine, the strength of Jarrah, or the soft look of Tasmanian oak. In flooring, stairs, furniture or fireplaces, nothing can come close to the look of natural solid timber from Limex. Limex, the solid timber specialists. Bedford Street, Port Adelaide.
The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.
Welcome back. Now, this is the last segment of the show, so we're going to try and tie all this up together and leave you with some really, really strong things to think about. So, Paul, where did you want to go now?
Well, I think it's just such a diverse subject. But one of the things that fascinates me about our conversation is that when I read the Gospels myself, I find something profound that this God, if he exists, let's suppose, ask that question first, would come in human form as his creation to want to reveal himself in a human attribute, in a human, knowable, tangible way. And then he does something that I think is not like any other God. Every other God throughout the ages and history of thought and humanity and society has said, you offer a sacrifice to me, that you may offer your sacrifice, and if I'm pleased with you, then I may give you some benevolence. But we see something stunning, that the one that says he's the true creator God, comes in humanity and says, I will become the living sacrifice to put an end to a sacrificial system so that you will live perpetually.
Even a religious system.
Yeah, perpetually. He ends that religious system under the Old Testament to say, you will live perpetually in my favour, in my love, in my presence, in my very life flow, as I always intended for you. I mean, what do we do with that message?
Well, firstly, obviously we need to model it, and we need to share it. What I find fascinating is that when people do come to God, that everyone comes to God from a completely different station.
Sure.
Unique backgrounds, weaknesses, trauma, childhood experiences, prejudices, and then you start to see how God starts to rebuild or change. And as you were saying before, it is unique because it's not a case of proving yourself or being good enough. It's actually receiving a free gift of benevolence. And how it affects every single person. And, you know, if you start to get it, Jesus says, by their fruits you shall know them. You know by the love they walk in, and by the nature of God actually manifests through that person.
So there's an evidence of that connectivity, of that faith reality that actually works into your life.
Well, absolutely, yes. But I'd like to add that. I mean, I could tell you the story of my own life and how God impacted me. But there is more reason than that of why I am a Christian. It's not just because there's a set of circumstances and something that I've felt and experienced that made me a Christian. I'm also primarily a Christian because it's on all the worldviews that I've looked at, it's the one that is coherent, that explains the facts, that makes sense of life and brings meaning and morality, and actually makes life look like a holistic thing to me. So in addition to that, I experienced that God personally. And therefore, it goes beyond my thinking. Now, I appreciate it with my thinking, and I appreciate it with my heart. So it's quite a deep-seated thing.
Yeah.
So what's this experience of the heart? I mean, there might be some viewers that are watching and saying, well, I can understand intellectually, but we can't really grasp things by faith intellectually, can we? It sort of transcends our intellectual present understanding and worldview.
Psychology recognises it can only go so far. You know, the therapeutic relationship or the process of therapy. And before I did my degree, is that I was talking to some psychologists years ago, and there's a part in man that it seems to, where people have repressed pain or different areas, and yet, well, religion or spirituality, Christianity, it talks about the heart. And there, what is exciting is if people reach out, and it can be verbalised through prayer or worship or in their room alone, but if they actually start reaching out and saying, God, from a heart level, not an intellectual level, not an academic level, not from a sociological level, from their heart, a connection starts to take place. And I didn't do the research per se. I was actually raised in culturally an atheistic home. My dad's quite a funny guy. He says, Todd, your mother and I have decided to you're free to believe what you want to believe, but I'm telling you now there is no God. And so that's how I was raised. And yet I had a dramatic encounter through my brokenness, and then it's been but it's a heart journey.
Yes.
And as opposed to, you know, I mean, I've studied and got a couple of degrees, but as you unfold that heart journey, that's where that connection spirituality is.
So your faith hasn't caused your brains to be kissed goodbye, or
no, it's actually what it does, because it actually stimulates a line of inquiry. You actually don't have to put your head in the sand like the ostrich, because if faith is real, if these spiritual issues are real, they're robust.
Yes.
And they can handle any scrutiny and actually take you. So the more I studied science, the more quantum physics, all these other things, I'm just going, wow, this is amazing, because it actually started. There are empirical realities as opposed. So the heart journey, powerful and real. Empirical realities, they're all there, and they all work together. They're not mutually exclusive.
Well, it's interesting that Jesus, when he died, did not say to us, you know, I will come back to you spiritually.
No.
Which leaves it in the area of subjectivity and all that. He said, I will be raised and, you know, in body, which is an empirical statement, because you can test that.
And there were witnesses.
Yeah.
Yes.
People think of the resurrection and they just think, oh, that's some, you know, hairy-fairy. But no, actually the guy said he would come back in body, you know. There would
he
be a
actually died
resurrection
and was actually raised from the dead
body.
as a historical fact.
But it's empirical. You can test that.
Yes.
If you're
That's
writing a
true.
book about somebody who did all these miracles and then died and then raised again, but he never raised again, unless there were hundreds of witnesses. It's like saying, you know, Marilyn Monroe came back from the dead and she landed on the moon and blah, 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 blah. Elvis is living in South Africa and he owns a ranch. And so because there's not those eyewitnesses, it can't perpetuate. So it is based around, it's not becoming philosophical in the abstract. It's based around empirical eyewitnesses. It was robust. It stood you know, robust inquiry, and that the two work together. So the heart journey and also strong evidence.
And you would expect differences in eyewitness accounts because of emphasis, and we know that in courts. We know that you can have 10 people witnessing a single event, but they'll all describe the event slightly differently because that's human nature. So it makes sense, doesn't it, that the eyewitness accounts would vary a little bit, because that's the nature of being an eyewitness.
Oh, well, that's a mark
And
of
that's a different
authenticity.
show. We've come to the end of this journey, guys. I'm really sorry, because we're just getting warmed up. But please, go to our Facebook page. If this has stirred something up in you, we want to know about it. Because, you know, God is not an abstract, as you've heard here today. And whether you believe in religion, whether you believe, that's okay. Talk to us. Because we'll come back, we'll do a similar show, I think, down the track, because it's a very, very interesting subject. Until next time, I'm Pamela Segneri.
And I'm Paul Tothill.
And this is The Burning Question.
The Burning Question with your hosts Pamela Segneri and Paul Tothill.